Stinging rebuke today from the federal judiciary on a day one priority for Donald Trump, an executive order that curbs birthright citizenship for children born here of undocumented immigrants. It strikes at some of the basic questions of what it means to be an American. A federal district court judge in Maryland putting in place a nationwide injunction against the Trump administration's order, and it appears to have some staying power. As the New York Times reports, in most cases, a preliminary injunction remains in force until a case is resolved or a higher court overturns it. Speaking from the bench, the judge said this, quote, "The executive order conflicts with the plain language of the 14th Amendment, contradicts 125-year-old binding Supreme Court precedent, and runs counter to our nation's 250-year history of citizenship by birth. The United States Supreme Court has resoundingly rejected the president's interpretation of the citizenship clause of the 14th Amendment. In fact, no court in the country has ever endorsed the president's interpretation. This court will not be the first." The judge lays out the stakes of the case for every American, adding this, quote, "Citizenship is a most precious right expressly guaranteed by the 14th Amendment of the Constitution. It is said that the right to U.S. citizenship is a right no less precious than life or liberty." The case was brought by 5 undocumented pregnant women and an immigrant rights group. An attorney for the plaintiffs told the judge this, quote, "The parents covered by the order have lived in the U.S. for decades. They're not temporary visitors. They have made America their home, and they're entitled to have their children subject to the same constitutional right that every other child in America has." Today's ruling is the administration's second defeat in the matter of a few weeks on this issue. Last month, a federal judge in Seattle had issued a 14-day restraining order and a ruling in which he slammed the Trump administration, saying this, quote, "I have difficulty understanding how a member of the bar can state unequivocally that this is a constitutional order. It boggles my mind. Where were the lawyers when this decision was being made?" We're back with Sarah and John. Sarah, this kind of language, when it came from, I think it was a federal judge named Judge Carter in California, seemed to focus the minds of Congress. It preceded the special the congressional investigation into January 6th. And I wonder if you think the clarity with which the judges are rebuking the overreach by Trump and the lack of any founding in the Constitution will have any slowing impact.
I do think it'll have some slowing impact, but more importantly, the Constitution will have the slowing impact. I'm sorry, but I'm just going to read you the quick clause in the 14th Amendment, which says, "All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws." That's it. That's what it says. And so this isn't a public opinion question. This isn't a question of like what Donald Trump thinks. It's just right there, stated plainly in the Constitution. And any judge who can read will uphold it. And so, I mean, I guess you could get to some place where there's some kind of a constitutional showdown between, Donald Trump's executive order and the courts. But there's not Donald Trump would have to be overriding the Constitution. Like, there's just no question here. It's a straightforward thing. And look, Donald Trump has obviously spent a lot of time demonizing immigration and our immigration laws, and maybe they will even succeed here as a messaging matter in making the fact that people born in this country from people who are undocumented that they shouldn't be citizens. But even if they won the public opinion fight, they would still lose the constitutional fight because it is completely straightforward.
Maybe. I mean, maybe in the sense that maybe in the sense that I think that, look, it was Sarah's colleague, Jonathan Last, who was on the podcast with me, on my podcast earlier this week, who made this point. The plain language of the Constitution endorses birthright citizenship. There are 2 votes in the Supreme Court who will vote for Trump on anything, in Clarence Thomas and Justice Alito. Okay, you got a 7-2 court at the Supreme Court, which is where this case is going to go. Get a 7-2 ruling in favor of rejects Trump's claim. Trump, as Jonathan Last asked the question, Trump stands up and goes, tells the Supreme Court to pound sand, says, we think this ruling is illegitimate, and we're just not going to issue birth certificates to children of undocumented people in America. What happens then? Does anybody really think that that's inconceivable, that Trump will test the Supreme Court's power in that way at some point in this term? Does everybody think, Sarah? I don't think Sarah thinks that's inconceivable.
Sarah?
It's not inconceivable.
Yeah. Well, quoting Jonathan Last at me is unfair because he is the bleakest colleague
Yes.
and friend that I have.
Yes, but not wrong. But sometimes not wrong.
I want to bring in Chris Maddie, who is representing the 7 FBI agents in the case. He's a partner at Kossoff and Beater and a former federal prosecutor. Good to have you back on the show. Chris, when do you expect to hear back from the court on this, and how long could the temporary restraining order last?
Well, the court scheduled a hearing, Chris, for tomorrow at 10:30. That'll be our first opportunity to argue before a district judge that our temporary restraining order should be entered, and that request is to prohibit the Department of Justice from publicly disseminating the names of agents who participated in the January 6th investigations. We're hopeful that will be resolved tomorrow, that we will have an order, and then we can continue to pursue our case if necessary. This is the last place that we want it to be. It's kind of preposterous that federal agents should have to sue the government that they serve in order to protect themselves. But the actions of the acting leadership at the Justice Department in the days leading up to Monday, and then obviously the effort to identify every single agent who participated in that investigation, really left us no choice but to take measures to protect our agents.
Well, we're already seeing, as I understand it, some of the pardoned January 6th defendants or convicted January 6th offenders going online, including a post you referenced from Proud Boys founder Enrique Tarrio. Have any of your clients experienced problems, harassment as a result of this yet?
Well, we represent the FBI Agents Association, so that's some 14,000 members and current and former members of the FBI. And it is, in a sense, part of the job when you're in law enforcement to have to deal with dangerous people. But we shouldn't have to deal with being hung out to dry by our own government. And so what we are really hoping is that the new leadership at the Justice Department assures us, and hopefully that'll happen in court tomorrow. We would like nothing more than for the Department of Justice lawyers to come in tomorrow and say to the court that the Department of Justice is not going to be publicly identifying any agents, that there won't be any disciplinary proceedings other than the normal disciplinary proceedings, and we can move past this. But we are not going to allow agents of the FBI to be targeted and be the subjects of political retribution simply for having done their jobs.
I'm sure you know that the acting Deputy Attorney General, Emil Bovee, sent a memo to agents today, and it says that no FBI employee who follows orders and carried out their duties, quote, in an ethical manner with respect to those investigations is at risk of termination or other penalties. What's your message to the agents you represent in response to what Emil Bovee wrote?
Well, we're looking forward to hearing what the Department of Justice has to say in court tomorrow before a federal judge. I mean, I think that the email you reference may be a step forward. It certainly struck me as a response to our lawsuit. And if they come in tomorrow and say, of course, the Department of Justice doesn't intend to identify any agents publicly, of course, we're going to follow lawful channels for reviewing any agent's conduct, that'll make us very happy. But that representation is going to have to be made to a judge, and we expect that the judge would enter an order accordingly. That's what we're hoping for.
We just, excuse me, we just heard from Democrat Jamie Raskin. He, of course, was a member of the J6 Select Committee, and he expressed his concerns about the Trump administration's purge of DOJ officials and FBI agents. Let's listen.
So what's the message? Don't participate in the prosecution of any crimes that you might think Donald Trump approves of. Don't get caught enforcing the law in a way Donald Trump might not approve of.
You've said that an unlawful purge of FBI agents would be catastrophic to national security, and I wonder what you're hearing from the people inside the FBI, the level of concern and the conversations you're having.
Well, certainly, I mean, there's a high level of concern. I mean, filing for a temporary restraining order was really a last resort. I do think that the actions taken by the acting leadership of the Justice Department over the last few days.
So Donald is finding out that as much as he wants to see himself as a king and demand everyone else, whether it's Americans, Canadians, Mexicans, whoever, see him as a king and emperor of the world, the reality is punching him right in the jaw, right? And we're seeing this in court as they reject his moves and also as civil servants take him down. Because let's be clear, it is true that the president and the executive branch that's headed up by the president does have a lot of leeway when it comes to staffing the government. Like Congress's job is to pass laws. They're the ones that handle the raising of money and things like that. But in terms of spending it and running the organizations that help administer the laws, that is the job of the president and his staff and his cabinet and what have you. But just because you head up the branch doesn't mean the workers in that branch have no rights. And so those workers often have civil service protections and basic labor rights. Sometimes they have unions, staff organizations. And so what Trump is going to quickly realize is you can't just fire people. You can't just fire people in certain positions, at least, without cause, without notice. Not only is that illegal in some cases, it violates those people's labor rights. Like, we're not, get off the big constitutional position. It's like, you can't just fire somebody without notice in many cases. Donald Trump is not a king in that way. He might have the authority in some cases to fire some of these people, but not without notice. And as noted yesterday, the day before we talked about this, you can't just turf an FBI officer. Like, there are ways you can discipline and fire an FBI officer, but it's not from the desk of the Oval Office. So Donald took a shocking defeat in court today, and he's going to keep on taking those L's for the next 4 years.